When an avoidant and an empath both go no contact, something happens that almost nobody talks about, and it is usually nothing like what people expect. Most assume the empath falls apart while the avoidant simply moves on without looking back. They imagine one person drowning in emotion while the other remains completely unaffected, but that is rarely what is happening beneath the surface. What unfolds inside both people is far more complex, far more painful, and far more revealing than a typical breakup story. When these two personalities lose contact, they are not only losing a relationship, they are losing the mirror they unknowingly relied on to understand themselves. That changes everything. Stay with me because over the next few minutes, we are going to walk through exactly what happens to both of them, day by day and week by week, and why so many eventually make the same mistake that pulls them back into the exact cycle they were trying to escape. If you have ever experienced this kind of relationship, or if you are living through one now, much of what follows will probably feel surprisingly familiar. Before we continue, comment the word mirror below. Just that single word. It lets me know you are here, paying attention, and it also helps this message reach others who genuinely need to hear it. And if you enjoy thoughtful conversations about emotional intelligence, attachment, and relationships, be sure to subscribe because this is exactly what this channel is about. Now let us begin at the actual starting point, not when someone first considers going no contact, not during the weeks of debating, journaling, or asking friends for advice. I mean the precise moment it officially begins. The last message has been sent, the final phone call has ended, the door has closed, the silence begins. For the empath, that instant often feels like falling from a great height in slow motion. For the avoidant, it initially feels like finally taking a full breath after holding it for too long. Those two completely different emotional experiences create the foundation for everything that follows. To understand why, you first have to understand what both people have been unconsciously doing throughout the relationship. An empath feels emotions deeply, not in an exaggerated or romantic way, but in a very real and often exhausting way. They naturally notice emotional shifts that other people overlook. A subtle change in facial expression, a different tone of voice, an unspoken sadness hidden behind ordinary conversation. They absorb emotional information almost automatically. Inside a relationship, this sensitivity becomes both their greatest strength and their greatest challenge because they become extraordinarily tuned in to their partner's inner world. The avoidant, by contrast, usually learned very early in life that emotional closeness was unsafe. That lesson may have come through emotionally unavailable parents, inconsistent affection, criticism, rejection, or simply growing up in an environment where feelings were ignored. The child quietly learned that needing people often led to disappointment, so independence became the safest strategy. As an adult, that person still desires connection, but closeness activates an internal alarm that tells them to protect themselves before they get hurt. When an empath and an avoidant come together, something powerful happens. The empath sees the hidden pain beneath the avoidant's surface and feels drawn toward it. They sense that behind the emotional distance is someone capable of deep love if only they could feel safe enough to open up. The avoidant, often for the first time in years, feels deeply understood without having to explain themselves. The empath notices what they never say aloud. They feel accepted without exposing every vulnerable part of themselves. That experience is incredibly comforting, yet it is also deeply frightening because it moves them closer to the very intimacy they have spent years trying to avoid. Soon, the familiar pattern begins. The empath reaches for more closeness. The avoidant creates more distance. The empath interprets that distance as proof they have not loved enough, so they give more, sacrifice more, and try harder. The avoidant feels increasing pressure from all of that emotional intensity and responds by pulling away even further. The cycle repeats itself over and over until eventually someone reaches emotional exhaustion. Sometimes it is the empath, sometimes it is the avoidant, sometimes both arrive there almost simultaneously. That is usually when no contact finally begins. What makes no contact so fascinating is that it is not simply the absence of communication. It becomes an entirely different kind of conversation, one that happens silently inside both people at exactly the same time. Although neither person is speaking, their minds continue talking constantly, and those two inner conversations could hardly be more different. For the empath, the first day rarely feels peaceful. It does not feel empowering. Instead, it often feels like emotional free fall. Their nervous system has spent months or even years tracking every message, every silence, every emotional shift, every tiny change in their partner's behavior. Suddenly, there is nothing left to monitor, but the system that has learned to constantly scan for connection does not simply stop working. It becomes even more active. That is why they keep checking their phone. Not because they are weak, but because their nervous system has been conditioned to search for signs that everything is okay. Their mind replays conversations over and over, trying to identify the exact sentence or moment when everything changed. They often experience guilt, even if the relationship caused them enormous pain, because empaths naturally assume responsibility for other people's emotional well-being. The possibility that the avoidant might be hurting somewhere in silence becomes almost unbearable to imagine. Beneath all of that sits an even deeper question that many empaths struggle to recognize. If I am no longer taking care of this person, then who am I? Many empaths develop their identity around being needed, around being the emotional caretaker, the person who understands everyone else while quietly neglecting themselves. Without that role, they suddenly feel uncertain about their own identity. That experience is not weakness, it is a deeply human response to years of emotional conditioning. The avoidant experiences something very different. During the first days of no contact, relief is usually the strongest emotion. They finally feel as though the pressure has lifted. The expectations, the emotional intensity, the fear of disappointing someone they genuinely cared about all temporarily disappear. Even if they feel guilty about that relief, they usually push the guilt aside because acknowledging difficult emotions has never felt comfortable. Instead, they become busy. They throw themselves into work, hobbies, exercise, social plans, or new projects. Staying occupied becomes their primary coping strategy because activity prevents stillness, and stillness allows feelings to surface. For a while, that strategy appears to work, but somewhere around the second or third week, something begins to shift. The silence changes character. Instead of feeling peaceful, it starts feeling strangely empty. Small moments begin appearing throughout the day. They hear a song, they see something funny, they have a difficult experience at work. Instinctively, they reach for the person they used to share those moments with before remembering that person is no longer there. Their immediate response is usually to minimize those feelings. They remind themselves why the relationship was difficult. They tell themselves the empath was too emotional, too demanding, or too intense. They convince themselves they are better off alone. But constantly minimizing genuine feelings requires emotional energy, and eventually that effort becomes exhausting in ways they never anticipated. This is one of the biggest misunderstandings about avoidant attachment. Their silence does not necessarily mean they never cared. Often, it simply means they process loss very differently. While the empath feels nearly everything immediately, the avoidant often experiences grief in delayed waves that arrive only after enough distance has removed the pressure they originally needed to escape. When an avoidant and an empath both go no contact, something happens that almost nobody talks about, and it is rarely what people expect. Most assume the empath completely falls apart while the avoidant simply moves on without looking back. In reality, neither of those assumptions is completely true. What unfolds is far more complex, painful, and revealing than a typical breakup story. When these two personalities cut contact, they do not just lose a relationship, they lose the mirror they had been using to understand themselves, and that changes everything. Stay with me, because over the next few minutes, we are going to explore exactly what happens to both of them, day by day and week by week, and why so many eventually make the same mistake that pulls them back into the same exhausting cycle. If you have ever experienced this kind of relationship, or if you are living through one now, much of what follows will probably feel uncomfortably familiar. Before we continue, take a moment to comment the word mirror. It lets me know you are here, paying attention, and it helps this message reach others who genuinely need it. If thoughtful conversations about emotional intelligence and relationship psychology resonate with you, subscribe because this is exactly what we explore here. Now let us begin at the moment no contact truly starts. Not the weeks of debating whether it is the right decision, not the conversations with friends or the endless journaling beforehand. The real beginning is the exact second when the final message is sent, the last phone call ends, or the final goodbye is spoken. It is the instant when silence replaces connection. For the empath, that silence feels like stepping off a cliff in slow motion. For the avoidant, it often feels like finally taking a full breath after holding it for far too long. Those completely opposite emotional experiences become the starting point for everything that follows. To understand why, you first have to understand what these two people have been doing to one another throughout the relationship, usually without realizing it. The empath experiences emotions deeply, not in a romanticized way, but in a way that is genuinely consuming. They instinctively notice subtle shifts in mood, changes in tone, hidden pain, and unspoken needs. Their emotional radar constantly scans the people they love, often before those people are even aware of their own feelings. With an avoidant partner, this gift becomes both a blessing and a burden. The avoidant's nervous system learned long ago, usually during childhood, that emotional closeness carried some form of danger. Perhaps affection was inconsistent. Perhaps vulnerability was ignored, criticized, or met with rejection. Whatever the cause, the nervous system quietly adopted one belief: closeness is risky, while independence feels safer. As adults, avoidant individuals still long for connection, but they also fear it. When they meet an empath, something powerful happens. The empath sees beneath the surface and senses hidden pain. They believe that with enough patience and love, they can help the avoidant feel safe enough to open up. Meanwhile, the avoidant often experiences something they have not felt in years. They feel understood without needing to explain themselves. The empath seems to read their emotions effortlessly, making them feel deeply seen without requiring immediate vulnerability. This creates an intensely magnetic connection. The empath pursues closeness while the avoidant gradually retreats. The more the avoidant withdraws, the harder the empath tries to reconnect. The empath interprets distance as a signal to love more deeply, while the avoidant experiences that increasing closeness as overwhelming pressure. Both people believe they are protecting the relationship, yet both unknowingly strengthen the very cycle that slowly tears it apart. Eventually, someone reaches their limit. Sometimes the empath becomes emotionally exhausted after years of giving. Sometimes the avoidant reaches a point where intimacy feels unbearable. Occasionally, both happen at nearly the same time, and no contact begins. What makes no contact so significant is that it is not merely the absence of communication. It becomes an entirely different kind of conversation, one that happens silently inside each person's own mind. For the empath, the first day rarely feels peaceful. Instead, it feels like emotional free fall. Their nervous system has spent months or years tracking their partner's moods, responses, silences, and emotional shifts. Suddenly there is nothing left to monitor, but the internal tracking system does not simply switch itself off. It continues searching for a signal that no longer exists. This is why many empaths constantly check their phones during the first days of no contact. It is not because they lack strength. Their nervous system is simply continuing the pattern it learned during the relationship. Their mind replays conversations repeatedly, searching for the exact moment everything changed, hoping that understanding the past might somehow protect the future. Many also experience overwhelming guilt, even when ending the relationship was necessary. Empaths often absorb responsibility for other people's emotional pain, making it incredibly difficult to tolerate the idea that someone they love might now be hurting alone. Beneath all those thoughts lies an even deeper question that often remains unspoken. If I am no longer taking care of this person, then who am I? For many empaths, especially those raised in environments where caring for others became their identity, this question reaches the core of who they believe themselves to be. The avoidance experience looks entirely different at first. During the early days of no contact, many genuinely feel relieved. The emotional pressure seems to disappear. They no longer feel responsible for someone else's emotional needs. The constant tension surrounding closeness temporarily fades, and their nervous system experiences that as freedom. Rather than sitting with their emotions, most avoidants immediately become busy. They throw themselves into work, exercise, hobbies, projects, or social activities. Their primary coping strategy has always been movement and distraction, and for a while, that strategy appears to work. Yet somewhere around the second or third week, something subtle begins to shift. The silence starts to feel different. It is no longer peaceful. It becomes strangely hollow. Unexpected moments appear when they instinctively reach for the empath in their mind. They hear a song, experience a difficult day, or see something amusing, and for a brief moment, they want to share it before remembering there is no one to send it to anymore. Instead of acknowledging that they miss the relationship, many avoidants immediately rationalize those feelings. They tell themselves they simply need more time, or that they are adjusting to being alone again. They focus on the relationship's flaws and remind themselves why distance was necessary. Yet suppressing emotions requires constant energy, and eventually that effort becomes exhausting. Around the same time, the empath begins experiencing a quieter transformation. The initial emotional chaos gradually settles into exhaustion, and within that stillness, something remarkable starts to happen. For the first time in a long while, the empath begins hearing their own inner voice again. When your attention has been focused almost entirely on another person's emotional world, your own needs slowly become quieter. During no contact, however, that constant external focus disappears. Slowly, your own thoughts become audible again. Many empaths begin asking difficult questions that have nothing to do with their former partner. Why did I remain in a relationship that repeatedly hurt me? Why did I interpret withdrawal as an invitation to love harder instead of recognizing it as incompatibility? Why did my self-worth become tied to whether someone emotionally unavailable could finally choose me? These questions are painful, but they represent genuine healing because they redirect attention inward rather than outward. Meanwhile, the avoidant often reaches another turning point between weeks 4 and 6. Human memory naturally softens difficult experiences over time. Gradually, the avoidant begins remembering the relationship through the lens of its happiest moments rather than its struggles. They think about the early days, when being deeply understood felt comforting rather than overwhelming. They remember the empath's warmth, kindness, and emotional presence. As those memories become stronger, they begin missing the empath in ways they did not expect. This is often when the temptation to reconnect becomes strongest. Many avoidants eventually send a simple message. It may say something like, "I was thinking about you, I saw something that reminded me of you," or simply, "How have you been?" The message seems casual, but it often arrives after weeks of quiet internal conflict. For the empath, receiving that message can feel earth-shattering. It appears to confirm every hope they secretly held during no contact. It feels like proof that love finally won. Yet this moment is also one of the most dangerous. In many cases, nothing fundamental has changed. The avoidant simply reached a point where the discomfort of separation temporarily outweighed the fear of intimacy. Once contact resumes and emotional relief returns, the original relationship dynamic often reappears almost automatically. The empath begins giving again. The avoidant begins withdrawing again. The familiar cycle quietly starts over. The only lasting difference comes when genuine inner work has happened during the separation. For the empath, healing means discovering why emotionally unavailable love felt so compelling in the first place. Many eventually recognize that the push and pull dynamic mirrors emotional experiences from childhood, where love felt inconsistent and had to be earned rather than freely received. True healing begins when they stop measuring their worth through another person's willingness to choose them, and instead learn to care for their own emotional needs first. For the avoidant, healing requires something even more uncomfortable. They must stop running from emotional discomfort long enough to ask what their distance has always been protecting them from. They begin exploring fears of abandonment, engulfment, rejection, or vulnerability that have shaped every relationship they have ever had. Without that self-reflection, the same cycle simply repeats with different people. When genuine healing occurs, something remarkable changes. The empath no longer chases because they no longer feel compelled to earn love through pursuit. They have built enough inner stability that they no longer depend on another person's emotional availability to feel secure. This often surprises the avoidant because the old dynamic no longer exists. Sometimes they retreat permanently in search of a more familiar pattern elsewhere. Other times, that unexpected shift finally becomes the catalyst that encourages real emotional growth. If both people have truly changed, reconciliation may become possible, not as a continuation of the old relationship, but as something entirely new built on healthier foundations. Even more often, however, the greatest gift of no contact is not reunion, it is transformation. The empath learns that love does not require abandoning themselves. They discover relationships built on consistency, emotional safety, and mutual care instead of uncertainty. At first, those relationships may feel unfamiliar because calmness lacks the emotional intensity they once associated with love. Over time, however, they realize that peace is not boring, it is secure. The avoidant, if they commit to genuine growth, learns that intimacy does not erase independence. They discover they can ask for space without disappearing and return without needing to be chased. Ultimately, both personalities are responding to the same underlying wound. The empath fears they are lovable only when they give endlessly. The avoidant fears they are lovable only from a distance because true closeness might expose their deepest insecurities. No contact, at its healthiest, is not a strategy designed to win someone back. It is an opportunity to finally hear the stories each person has been telling themselves about love, worth, and belonging. The relationship may have been the classroom, but the silence becomes the place where the real lesson finally lands. What each person chooses to do with that lesson shapes every relationship that follows. If any part of this resonated with you, whether you recognized yourself in the empath, the avoidant, or perhaps in both, remember this: real healing does not begin when someone returns. It begins when you stop abandoning yourself in order to keep someone else close. From that place of wholeness, every future relationship has the chance to become healthier, calmer, and more genuine than the one that came before.